So welcome to everyone that's joined us. I just want to say that you can leave your cameras on if you want, but please mute your sound so that we don't get a lot of feedback from everyone. You can always turn it back on if you want to ask a question in person, and you can just, turn your camera on and wave a little bit and get our attention. You can also ask questions in the sidebar. So there's just a little chat on the left-hand side. If you see the message icon, you can open that up and ask questions at any point during the conversation. So today, we're actually welcoming Amber Inwood. She's coming from the Barrie Art Museum, which is part of Old Dominion University, and she's a museum education specialist. And speaking with her is Laura Busby, who is our new programs assistant, and she actually has a background in museum education, and is coming from the Vancouver Art Gallery. So she just moved here recently, and she's the perfect person to be talking to Amber. So I'm actually going to sit this one out. I'll be on the sidelines, and I will let you, Laura, and you, Amber, have the bigger discussion.
Thank you, Callie. Hello, Amber.
Hello. G'day.
Thank you so much for your willingness to participate in the session and share with us all of your experience putting together this training program for your education team. And thank you to all of the RSVPers. It was really wonderful to receive all of your enthusiastic RSVPs. So we're really excited that you're excited about this topic. Amber, let's jump right in because I know you have a lot of information to share with us. First question, if you could tell us a little bit about the Barrie Art Museum, and if you could also tell us about the Barrie Art Museum's Docent program.
Okay, so again, my name is Amber. I'm the contracted museum education specialist here. As for the Barrie Art Museum, I'm actually sitting within our first gallery called A Passion for Colour and Form. If you're wondering what that is in the background. So the Barrie Art Museum is located on the campus of Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. It's important to note, though, that though we are located on the campus, we're affiliated with Old Dominion University. So we are our own non-for-profit under the Museum Foundation. And we are a relatively new institution. We opened in November 2018 to a huge crowd of people. It was a wonderful time to open for the community. And the way that Barrie Art Museum came about was two very generous donors, Mr. and Mrs. Barrie, or Carolyn and Richard Barrie, donated $35 million to Old Dominion University for the formation and for the building and also the operations of a art museum that would be here to serve not only the community of student and faculty, but also the surrounding community. And so the museum is primarily made up of what's called the Founders Collection, which is the personal collection which Mr. and Mrs. Barrie actually donated. So it's a public collection, and it's primarily made up of American contemporary paintings, as well as sculpture and glass. And have a relatively small staff at the moment. And what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today is our pilot Gallery Educator program, which, and again, I want to say pilot because the people that we had take part in it knew that coming into it, and actually it is an exciting time for them because they're in the unique opportunity to help inform us with how to do future iterations. And so essentially, just to give you a little bit of background about why I've said Gallery Educator program, and that kind of comes under that whole umbrella of inclusiveness. The term docent, we all kind of know it, right? But sometimes it comes with a different idea, or maybe some boundaries in place with what that role entails. And because we are located on a campus and we really want to try and engage the student population as well as the community in the program, we chose to rename it as a Gallery Educator program to see if we can maybe open up some people that maybe never thought of themselves as possibly being a docent or being a part of a museum volunteer crew, who would come and become a part of it. And so that was kind of our first step to being inclusive.
And what resources were most helpful for preparing for the pilot training session?
Okay, so just to maybe take a back step and let you guys know about our training session. It's important to note that the training, the diversity and inclusivity training was actually a part of our customer service training section, which we did at the end of our program training. And the reason we did that is because the topic of diversity and inclusivity does sometimes, it comes with some uncomfortable discussions, really. And so we felt that it was best to do this at the end, near the end, when we'd gotten to know everyone, so that folks could feel more comfortable to have those conversations, and also we could be more informed in the way that we facilitated those conversations, and also how to best do the training. And so the way that the Gallery Educator training worked is that we actually recruited just 7 people. We're small and we like to do things small first and give it a try. So we recruited 7 participants, and they took part in a once a weekend 3-hour training. And then as part of the training, we took a little bit of a different approach. My background is actually in cultural and science education, informal education. So I come from the interpretive world, in particular, the environmental interpretive world. And so I incorporated a training based on Tilden's 6 principles, which is an interpretive tool which is used in national parks, but also in museums all over the place. And really that tool it came with the premise that we were training these gallery educators to not just be communicators, but to actually develop their own themed tours themselves. And so that was the approach through these different processes. And so it added an extra complexity, I guess, to the way that they're incorporated into our programming. And so when looking at, back to your question, Laura, about resources, when it came to the time to talk about customer service, but also inclusivity and diversity, I looked to a lot of different resources. But I would say that my key pieces, which were really helpful for me, and I know that Callie is going to be providing links to these. The big ones which really helped me, especially going into this new in a pilot program and being on a campus, a lot of the inclusivity and diversity resources of the American Alliance of Museums website, in particular the working group on diversity, equity, accessibility and inclusion, which is the DEAI. They had some excellent documents, but also they're very practice-based. The other resources I looked to was the LGBTQ Alliance from AAM. Again, that was a really good resource. I also turned to Old Dominion University's Office of Equity and Diversity as well, and had a look through a lot of those pieces. And then finally, I just looked to my own personal experiences. In particular, having lived in Hawaii for 10 years, Hawaii is a very diverse but also inclusive place. And I was working within a museum which had multiple disciplines. And so when you work within a museum that has multiple disciplines, you get such an array and diversity of people. It's just innate in people to be very inclusive. So I reflected on a lot of the experiences that I had there as well.
And yeah, to add to Amber's point, Callie will make them available on the website. When we post the recording of this in about a day or two, we'll have a link to a bunch of different resources that Amber just mentioned, so you can take a look for yourself. In addition to the resources, Amber, what strategies did you use for the training session?
Well, I think maybe it's important to take a step back and talk about our approach to the pilot program in general, how we approached the Gallery Educator program and their training. So the strategies I used was really kind of set in place in order to enable our gallery educators to be educators, to be able to engage in complex thinking and adaptability. And a part of that was having them develop their own theme-based tours, and at the same time giving them the skills for that. So the strategy I used was the 6 principles of, the 6 interpretive principles of Tilden, Freeman Tilden. There's a resource on that, but essentially what it is those interpretive principles came about in the 1950s when the National Park Service was finding more and more visitors were coming to the parks, but the rangers and staff weren't quite understand, they didn't know how to necessarily communicate to the general public. And so they brought in Freeman Tilden, who was actually a playwright and an artist. And he came in and he developed these interpretive principles, which really are the fundamental backbone to a lot of interpretive principles today, and really a lot of how people do interpretation. And so there's 6 principles, but the 3 core principles of it is really about how you approach interpretation. And so how you approach being a gallery educator or a docent is that the first principle is that any interpretation that doesn't somehow relate to what is being displayed or described within the personality or the personal experience of the visitor will be sterile. That's one. So you have to make it relate. The information is not actually interpretation, it's a supportive piece. And that really you should reveal. It's about revealing the information as you go through a narrative. And then finally, that interpretation is an art. And so you have to have that, it's a creative process. And then also provocation, you want to provoke thought. And so when you look at those principles, it's really, at the end of the day, about the foundation of having intellectual accessibility for all, and that the interpreters, the people who are in there, are able to communicate with the general public and adapt so that things are intellectually accessible, and that there in itself is being inclusive. So on top of that, we also are very fortunate to have a design space which lends to something that's very relatable to the general public, which again comes down to inclusivity. And that's our exhibit spaces are designed under the premise of the slow art movement. Essentially, the slow art movement is a design principle, but also a museum principle in which the objects are placed, the design is, and the objects, how they relate to one another, is visitor-centric. And what they mean by that is that the number one goal is that any visitor coming into the space has an emotional connection. To give you an idea of an emotional connection, this space here is called A Passion for Colour and Form. I'll do a little turnaround. You can see how bright and colourful it is. And I had a 5-year-old little boy come in here and say to me that he felt like he was in a box of crayons.
I love that.
The fact that he felt that it's inclusive. So with respect to the Gallery Educator program, having that as a foundation to then Tilden's principles lent well to this strategy of eventually getting to the inclusivity and diversity training. It kind of set that mindset up already.
So it also sounds like a little bit of that is just making people comfortable and not, you know, make the space feel approachable from the beginning so that they're comfortable in that area and that feels more accessible. It's not even just about intellectual accessibility, but just finding ways of allowing them to sort of open up to even the conversation.
Now, at the same time, this space is also therefore not just the art lovers, but also the arts experts.
Mm-hmm.
So the space is there for that. So it's about balancing that as well. But really, we started out our educators training to be with the public first and foremost, the general public, and we are finding that our preliminary data is showing that a high majority of our visitors are either are not museum goers who have never been to a museum before, let alone an art museum.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, museums can be intimidating, especially if it has that white cube look, and contemporary art. It's really great to find ways to make people feel like they can learn in that space, they can bring something to the conversation, and an educator is such a great opportunity to facilitate that dialogue in the space. And I love that a child picked up on that so quickly, a box of crayons.
And it's funny because one of our gallery educators was in the space, and funnily enough, I had not shared that story at all. She said the same thing.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Huh.
One of the gallery, and that made me happy because I was like, she's getting it.
Mm-hmm.
She's getting it. So, so then when if you ask with what strategies did you use, more specific to the inclusivity and diversity piece, we incorporated it into the customer service aspect. What we did is, because we knew them quite well at this point, we set the stage for them to feel safe. Mm-hmm. Because the fact is that people can talk about diversity, they see diversity, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's an inclusivity in place. And so we needed to make sure there was a safe space when we did that training for people to feel included, to have those uncomfortable discussions. Mm-hmm. And so what we did is during that training is I had some videos to reflect on. And I myself went through some of the exercises myself. And one of them included unconscious bias and taking a step back and seeing your own unconscious bias. I thought that I was like one of the most inclusive people in the world. But once you kind of take a step back and look at yourself, it helps you with your lens.
So, sorry, what were these exercises that kind of helped you do that?
Well, one of, for me specifically, because it wasn't something that you can do in the actual training, mm-hmm. But what I did is there is a Harvard unconscious bias activity you can do. It's private. They do not collect any private information, so you can be 100% honest, and it's a questionnaire. And so I did that myself and kind of took a look at my own unconscious bias that maybe I didn't have. Also, conversation starters. A big piece was, back to even Tilden's principles of relating, starting those conversations off with an easier question, which was, when has anyone here felt included? And starting with that conversation, and then saying, well, anyone here, when have you felt excluded? And why do you think that is? And then building that comfort level up. Also allowing people, if they want to share anything, but also establishing with everyone that, this is a safe place to talk. Mm-hmm. And that also, if they wanted to come to me to talk individually and talk through some of these things, that I was also available, so they didn't feel like they had to do it then and there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it would be great if anyone else wanted to start a program like this, that they do what you did, which is take this unconscious bias test, because when we had talked before, you really said that this is something you need to explore yourself before you even go into the nitty-gritty of the other resources that we were talking about in terms of how to have a program like this. Because, yeah, you need to know what you are up against in terms of yourself as well.
Yeah, and I think at the same time, what's a really important aspect is that the gallery educators or docents themselves are given a platform but also the skills and time to develop their own critical thinking skills socially, and maybe even some social emotional learning through that process, so that when they are in that circumstance, they're not verbatim using certain terms. You know, there's obviously PC terms, etc., but that they're not focusing on that, that they're focusing on looking at, though they might have good intent, they need to be able to recognize if what they're doing or saying, or what they could do or say, might impact someone. And so by going through that process of social emotional learning for them, through the process of doing this, it allows them to be adaptable in these circumstances, which, you know, are not straightforward. They can sometimes be complex.
Yeah, I mean, it's always different depending on the day and time. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the other strategy is, you say strategies, is just creating a relationship. That was really just through this whole process, taking the time for there to be conversation and creating a trusting relationship with everyone, so that we can have those uncomfortable conversations, because that's the first step, really, to all of this. You really have to have those uncomfortable conversations.
Mm-hmm.
It helps to build the team, the feeling of teamwork.
Yeah.
Speaking of team and responses, what changes have you noticed as a result from the training session among the team?
Well, we had a couple of participants who actually also serve as paid gallery hosts here at the museum. And so beyond the Gallery Educator program, I've been fortunate to observe several of those individuals from the very beginning of starting at Barrie Art Museum, and how they interact with the public, not so much doing interpretation, but just general interaction. So they're really the folks that I can speak to seeing any change. And one thing I've really noticed is the individuals who were part of the Gallery Educator program post the customer service, I noticed that when they interacted with the public, they're much more confident. It's almost like we gave them the tool and the opportunity to be comfortable with how they were talking to people. It's almost like it was in them of how to do things. You know, we gave them the tools, as opposed to saying, don't use this word, don't use this word.
Mm-hmm.
That, I would say, that's probably the biggest change. And then, of course, myself, this whole process has really changed my lens on how I look at things. And that things that you don't even realize are an unconscious bias can be.
Did you encounter any challenges or surprises while preparing for or facilitating the session?
I would say one of the biggest challenges, and I'm sure several of the people who are watching in right now are in campus-based museums, is that more often than not, the resources that are provided through a lot of those departments within a museum are staff-based or institutionally based, whereas we come from customer service-based, and that's different. And so I think one of the challenges is looking to that and understanding the dialogue and working out that the dialogue may be different, but it's still the same thing, and how do you work through that dialogue when looking at those resources as well.
And you also worked a little bit with the department in your university, didn't you?
We looked through their documents. We had their documents, and we looked through. We also, for our program in general, we work through the ODU's HR department.
Yeah, that might be useful for others at academic art museums, especially, just to make sure that they're making those contacts within the university.
And do it early. Do it early, because you need to allow for that time for that kind of getting to know you stage, for them to understand we're coming from a customer service perspective, and it's not linear. It's not this step, this step, this step, and it's a very different lens that you have to come from. And so even terms that are used, you need to have that time to get that mutualistic understanding going on so that you can work together. And because there are some really great resources.
Yeah, and I think by the end of this, once we have some of the resources that you use to create your program, and encouraging people to go to the different departments of diversity and equity in their universities, they'll have a lot to start with. You know, at least get a feel for how to do this.
Yeah, and I think too, the one thing I did also is I looked into the university's student services in what they provide to students for accessibility. Because that there is a thread of inclusivity in itself. And so looking to what they provide can kind of help guide you with what, say, visitors might need.
Mm-hmm. Did you receive any feedback from the participants from the session? And did you conduct any kind of self-assessment of the training session?
Okay, so in talking to the feedback mechanism we used, we're a little bit different. Many of you are probably aware of the kind of more traditional evaluation process where you bring in an external evaluator who comes in and then maybe they speak to them on their own and then they give you the feedback. Well, because we felt that relationship was such an important piece to our program, we at the same time, it was part of the program, but also it was part of just the general consensus of the museum. So before the museum even opened, a research practitioner partnership was formed with the Centre for Educational Partnerships, which is a section of ODU whose goal is to support educators throughout the Hampton Roads region and beyond. And they do a lot of educational psychology research. And so we created a mutualistic relationship with them in developing projects in the museum that's going to be a long-lasting relationship. So they actually came in as not as specifically the evaluator, but as part of the Gallery Educator program. And then in part of that, they did a study on role identity. And from there, with the participants, and from there, we were able to extract feedback. But at the same time, I was able to develop a relationship with each of the individuals, participants, so that they could give me feedback, direct feedback, so that I could adjust as I went through the training. And one aspect of that was that about halfway through the training, I had a catch-up meeting with each of them, and I just had coffee. We talked about specific things about, so they got some one-on-one with me with developing their own theme tour, but at the same time, it was an opportunity for them to just talk to me, give some input, discuss some ideas. And so through that process, one of the pieces of feedback I got from a lot of the participants is that they really enjoyed the diversity and inclusivity piece, and in particular because it was put under the premise of customer service. They really enjoyed the discussions, and one big piece that they all said was looking at unconscious bias. They felt that that was an incredibly important piece to it. That really is the first step before going into this. That was a piece of feedback I got across the board. And then we were also given feedback as part of the role identity study. It's important to note that all the results for that were anonymous, but at the same time, there was just a generalized feedback that came out of it, like trends, and the trend that came out of that as well was the unconscious bias piece.
And Callie, I just noticed that you typed into the chat box. If anyone has questions at any time, feel free to turn on your mic or type them into that little box on the left-hand side of your screen. What are your short...
Take this off.
Oh, yeah, go for it. What are your short and long-term goals for the pilot training session?
Well, because the summer has been so quiet, our short-term goal is to get our gallery educators doing more on the floor program, on the floor tours. That's the short. We didn't expect to be so quiet, and so a short-term goal for that is revisiting our training. We're going to do a reboot training to get everyone kind of back up and starting and getting their themes going. And then on top of that, we'll do a little refresher with the inclusivity and the diversity piece and customer service. That's a short term. A long-term goal is hopefully we can incorporate a similar piece of training from perhaps our gallery hosts who come in, who are not necessarily doing tours, but they are interacting with the public all the time. And then long term, I hope that we can work out a way that we can make our program more inclusive to students. We did find that we didn't get that very many students sign up to be a part of it, despite changing the name and making certain efforts. The ones who did take part were already gallery hosts. And so that in itself, when we talk about diversity and inclusivity, it's rethinking how we do that recruitment. Because I think at the end of the day, diversity starts with the group that you're working with, and you have to start there.
What have you learned from this experience?
What have I learned? A lot. I've learnt that no one is without bias. It's there. Whether you mean to or not, it's there, and that it's something that everyone has to kind of just check in on themselves every now and then. I have also learnt that though intent is very much important to keep into consideration, that doesn't take away from the impact that perhaps something that you unknowingly might be doing or not doing to be inclusive. I think what else I've learned is, and I don't know if this is going more into a question of advice for others, is that with this kind of social, emotional learning that happens even within yourself as well as the participants, with talking and looking at diversity and inclusion, is that you have to find a mentor, someone who you can have those uncomfortable conversations with, to help you to go through this process so that you can be the best facilitator and advocate for the people who are participating with you, to bounce ideas off. Finding a mentor, it doesn't have to be someone on staff, it can be a family member, it can be anyone. I was very fortunate to have a very good mentor who I reached out to and just had these conversations with and bounced ideas off, I think. I've always kind of bounced ideas off, but really with this deeper level stuff, I really learned that you have to find that person or persons.
I mean, yeah, this seems like a very social process.
It really is.
Because you're asking a lot of uncomfortable questions, everyone sort of needs to be supported in a certain way to be able to kind of open up.
And that includes you.
Mm-hmm. And also, we have a question from Eric. Hi, Eric. And he was asking about the customer service orientation as part of your approach. And he asks if you can tell us a bit more about what that means and how or if security and other departments are part of the DAEI efforts at the Barrie.
What's the acronym? Sorry, who was saying?
DAEI.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Diversity, access,
good with
inclusion.
acronyms, I apologize.
Thank you.
Okay. With regard to that, that's one of our long-term goals. I know that security, etc., because they are not part, they are part of ODU. They're specifically hired by ODU, that they have their piece that they train for with the equity and diversity. That being said, long-term goal is that we do hope to do something like that with everyone. And again, if I can reiterate that this is a pilot, and it was a good group to pilot this piece with. With regard to customer service, how that fit into there, we started out with, the whole question of what is customer service, and then in going, that customer service is having people feel welcome, having people feel included. So we went through the customer service process of greeting people, how you make people feel welcome, professionalism, all of those things, and then that kind of led into well, how else do you make people feel welcome? You also make them feel welcome by feeling included, and then that's how we kind of fed it into that. So they kind of also had that external customer service lens on going into it, and that's kind of how we incorporated it into the same session. We did scenario-based. I did some scenario-based games with them and gave them scenarios that had happened to me already at the museum, or had happened to me in the past, or I actually reached out to a listserv community and said, hey, I'm looking for difficult circumstances.
Oh, that's interesting.
Scenarios, and people sent me their scenarios, and some of them were hilarious. But I was able to reword them and incorporate them as scenarios specific to Barrie Art Museum. And what I did is I almost threaded into there the equity and the inclusivity piece into some of those questions, because nothing's going to be either this or this. It's always subjective, and it's always circumstantial. And so I did this game where we had some scenarios, and we had to read those out and do them.
Mm-hmm.
Which they had a lot of fun with, because they tried the answers of what they would do. I made them act it out. Like, I made someone be a customer for part of it. They got a good kick out of being the customer. The visitor. And with that, we utilised some pieces within the museum in some of them, which might present some challenges.
Mm-hmm. And Kedra also had a question, and she asked if you could speak to the demographics of the initial participants of the program.
Okay. So demographically, everyone was local. We actually had all female, which is no surprise. Demographics-wise, we had several retirees, which is very much your common group that are a part of these programs. We also had a couple of students. So our age range went from early 20s all the way through to retiree age. And they were all local. And we had, we hadn't done any identity demographic questions with each of them yet. So, but with regard to age and backgrounds, that's kind of where each of the participants came from.
And can you remind us where Old Dominion University is?
So Old Dominion University is located in Norfolk, Virginia, and it's a very diverse urban community in the area. I can't speak to the specific percentages demographically right now, but what I can say is that there's a high percentage of students who go to ODU who are from the region, and of them are first generation college students. We do have a high percentage of African American students, and also the community as well.
And do you have any people of color in this program?
Yes, yes. And we do also within our gallery hosts as well.
What is your advice for others hoping to create similar programs? We touched on this a few parts of the conversation. But
I think, as I said before, first check your own biases. Do your own unconscious bias test. You don't necessarily have to do that Harvard test, but just kind of look at yourself. I think that's a really important thing because that kind of helps with dialogue and conversation with people involved in the training. Find a mentor, I would say. Doing the training near the end of the program is a good idea because then you've kind of set the scene and you've got that trusting relationship already in place. I think that's kind of, it's better for the group as a whole because there's kind of a camaraderie in the group as well by that stage, and people, they have a different level of self when they come into it. They're much more relaxed, they're more themselves, whereas often when people first go into a program like this, they're very, this is my best self, which is what everyone does. And so it's good to get that kind of safe group environment going before you go into this area. Look to not just only the inclusivity and diversity and equity division of your university, but also look at the accessibility. There really is some great resources there, and it'll also open your eyes up to some different things that you may not even be aware of that you're not doing that would actually aid in visitors feeling more included. And again, when looking at those resources, just keep in mind that they're generally not customer service oriented, and to remember that when you're going into them, and maybe seeking out some customer service focused resources as well.
Yeah, I hadn't really considered that because customer service, I mean, I don't think of people going to the museum as customers, I just think of them as visitors. But I never really thought about that as, I mean, you are doing them a service, and you already have a lot of these resources in the customer service world that can be applied. I just because of the wording, I wouldn't have associated that with a museum.
Well, and I think too, it's important to use that wording because I think it switches people's role as well in thinking that just something as simple as opening a door for someone, simple as walking outside with an umbrella if it's raining for a tour group coming in and providing umbrellas, that's customer service right there. And to think of those situations as well, when we talk about when folks have felt, included and maybe not included, I encourage people to talk about customer service circumstances where they felt included and didn't feel included as scenarios. So of course we got the classic, calling up a helpline and this is what happened, examples from people, right. But everyone talked about that and realized, that right there, that's your first interaction with people, and thinking from that perspective is important as well. Just gestures you do make someone feel included.
And we had another question just about how long the program was.
Well, that was another thing we changed up. We made the program shorter, and then a lot of typical docent programs, and that's why we're actually not even calling it a docent program anymore. We're calling it our Gallery Educator program. We shortened it, so we did 5 sessions, 3-hour sessions, and we spaced them out over either a week or 2 weeks, and then they were on a Saturday. The reason we chose a Saturday was so we could include the student population. What we found out was, a lot of programs are done on a Monday because that's when museums are closed operationally. And that's often a good day for a lot of the people who are usually part of it. But after talking to a lot of our gallery hosts, they brought up the really good point of, I thought, Saturday afternoon, because college students, they want to sleep in. A lot of them came back and said, no, well, a lot of us are working several part-time jobs here. It's a different type of college student. And a lot of those jobs are in hospitality, so they start in the afternoon. So can you do it in the morning? And so again, that was something that we did a little bit different, and we're hoping that model will help us the next time round to get more students involved. And again, we want to do some more credit-based incentives for it. So yeah, it lasted that long, but at the same time, it's ongoing. We don't see this as if the program is just going to keep, it's ongoing, and we'll build and build and build and build their roles up as they go. And so that's how long it took. And as for the customer service equity diversity piece, that was as part of one of our 3 hours near the end.
Great. And Laura, how is this, I mean, how are you thinking about this according to your own experience? I mean, you had been a gallery educator for quite a while. Was it 7 years?
Almost 7 years, yeah. And speaking of customer service, I was about 7 or 8 years deep in working at a restaurant by the time I started being an educator, and working with the public in that capacity as a server, as a host, that really informed how I was as an educator. It was about not so much just being in the space talking about art, but it was making people feel comfortable and welcome, and about you can bring to the conversation anything. It was really, yeah, it was the customer service part of serving really made me the educator that I was. And Eric's question about security, I thought that was really interesting, because as an educator in the space for only so many days a week, security is there all the time. They're the foot soldiers. They're always interacting with the public. And we had the most lovely guards at the Vancouver Art Gallery. And I think there was this urge for them to always want to engage with people. We're like, we're trained educators. We love that you love the art. But there is, I think, this appetite to engage. And they were so lovely in helping people find where the elevator was and making the space more accessible. So they are such an essential part of the visitor experience. So I think that's a really great point to bring up. How can security engage in this program as well? Because they play such an important part of the museum experience, safety, accessibility. They really do make a difference. Even when you think about your own experience going to museums, how security treats you really makes you think about how you feel comfortable in that space. So yeah, that's a really important. Yeah.
And Laura, you just to kind of piggyback off of that comment you were making about security, even though we couldn't because we literally only just opened, and so this is our first step in doing any training like this, and even though security wasn't a part of the official training, because the hours, everything, it just didn't have the capacity at this point, what I did do is I bounced a lot of ideas off them. A lot of the activities and scenarios, I talked to them about common scenarios they've had conversations. I did some of the activities with them, and we all got a good laugh out of it. But they were excellent. They gave amazing feedback. So, and it's almost in a way that because I was kind of bouncing ideas off them because of their personal experiences of being here all the time, just watching people's interactions, and also just their experience of being security guards and how to de-escalate situations. You know, they come with a wealth of knowledge. And so it was just really great to talk to them and bring them in that capacity. So even, you know, obviously you need to check with your supervisors because you don't want to take away from their job. You know, they've got to look after everything. But I did that, and they really brought a richness to the program.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I kind of hadn't thought about how much they would really interact, but yeah, definitely when I was at the Palmer Museum of Art, we interacted quite a bit and learned a lot from each other.
They see it all. They see everything on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
They're your eyes and ears. They really are. And they have some of the most interesting scenarios. And I think also maybe a other bit of advice is bring the scenario piece in as soon as you can, because people want tangible examples. Mm-hmm. They're kind of like, yeah, we've talked about it. Now give me some examples. How do I do this? How do I do that? And they're going to be chomping at the bit to say, how do I do this? How do I do that? And so if you get onto the scenarios a little bit quicker and make sure you dedicate a fair bit of time to that, that's going to help address that without you sitting there asking, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens?
Yeah. And it seems like part of the process would be collecting those but also collecting specific things, specific scenarios for, that space within that location and area, and that population, because it's always going to be different.
And similarly, to what you were saying, Laura, my background, I was actually a park ranger for 5 years. And so that brought out some pretty crazy scenarios with customer service, which was pretty out there. So I definitely feel that kind of came to the surface as well. And then also the personal experience of in Hawaii, I had a lot of tourists. We had a lot of tourists. And so that customer service angle had to come in as well, just as a side note.
Great.
Well, were there any more questions from our listeners here? We'll open the floor.
Don't see any more questions in the sidebar, but we're also going to put this video up. We've recorded everything, so we're actually going to put the recording up with a lot of the resources that we had talked about, that include sort of guidebooks that give some more tangible sort of advice on how to create a program like this, or what things to think about. Also some tests and a few other documents that just might help anyone that's thinking through the process of creating a program like this to train gallery educators. And also I am available. You can get in touch with me at cbuckley@collegeart.org, and I would be happy to relay any information or any questions that might come up. And we might create a bigger discussion about this in the future. I think that would be great.
If anything, I can say, if I can kind of speak to what you're talking about, Callie, is this whole this whole thing came about because of a listserv. Someone posting on the AAMG listserv saying, I'm doing a docent program. Does anyone have any resources? And all I wrote was, oh, hi, everyone. I just did a pilot. I'm happy to share what I have. And it was the overwhelming amount of people asking things for help. But really, because we're a pilot and I think every site is individual, it's not something where you can just say, here's my manual.
Right.
It's more of, we really needed to start a conversation. This really is I see this as a conversation starter, because I did this, but I'm not the expert. The people who I drew upon were experts, and I was guided wonderfully by my executive director and that with this whole process, but I'm no expert. And so I think just having this as a conversation starter to maybe get the ball rolling, there's definitely a need there.
Yeah, and I thought it was the perfect chance to actually have a little bit of a conversation here, and then also just share all of these resources that you found in your own research, so that more folks can sort of create programs like this. That's really what we're hoping to do. Also doing a service. So wonderful. Should we close it out?
Yes, and we also want to say to all of you listening, watching, please feel free to get in touch with us if you ever have an idea for a future coffee gathering. Sorry?
Sorry, not like that.
Oh.
I meant, like, if you have any more questions, beyond this forum with regard to what we've done, I'm more than happy to have a chat over the phone. Sorry about that, Laura.
No, thank you. And I think you even said we could put your contact information on the post, so that will be there as well. Thank you for that. If you or your colleagues are working on something interesting in an exhibition or resource, please feel free to share with the RAAMP community. We love to connect everyone and have these conversations. Even if it's a written resource, we'll post it to the website. So feel free to be in touch with anything you think might be of interest to the community. And thank you very much, Amber. This was so interesting, so informative, and thank you for being so generous with your time and efforts, and even bringing us into your wonderful gallery. I hope I can visit someday soon. Thank you very much.
Yes, just a quick Zoom. There you go. And we are free. That's part of our inclusivity, is that we want to remain as free as we can. So there's a little shot. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you, and have a good rest of the, afternoon? Great. All right. It was great joining everyone, and I hope to talk again soon.